watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following, and by viewers like you.
Hello, I'm Mark Golub, and you're about to meet a piece of American Jewish history and a remarkable human being who actually took part in some of the most dramatic moments in Jewish life during the 20th century. Her name is Ruth Gruber, and Ruth may be the most historically significant Jewish woman alive today. Now, if you don't know the name Ruth Gruber, let me tell you a little bit about this incredible human being. Ruth was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1911. She's well into her 90s. As a child, Ruth was a wonderkind, absolutely brilliant. When she earned her PhD in Cologne, Germany at the age of 20, she became the youngest person ever to have become a PhD. And Ruth Gruber's professional life as a gifted journalist and photographer, and author, and a member of the Roosevelt administration working with Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, thrust Ruth into the thick of world events of the time. Throughout her career, Ruth knew presidents, Israeli prime ministers, and virtually every major Jewish figure of the last 3/4 of a century. She's been recognized with numerous awards and honors. She's the author of nearly 20 books. In 1991, Ruth published volume 1 of her autobiography, Ahead of Time, My Early Years as a Foreign Correspondent. And in 2008, at the age of 97, Ruth Gruber was honored for her work in defending freedom of expression by the National Coalition Against Censorship. And as you're about to see, Ruth remains an unusually thoughtful individual and a lady of grace and elegance. I feel most privileged to have been welcomed into her home, and it's a true honor to be able to introduce you to a great American and a great and devoted Jew, Ruth Gruber. First of all, this is an extraordinary honor for me, and you are so gracious to have me into your home and spend some time with our audience. So the first thing, Ruth Gruber, is to say thank you so very, very much.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Ruth Gruber, how did you become who you are? Who were your parents?
Well, they weren't Zionists.
They were not?
No, they didn't have
Did you have a particularly Jewish upbringing?
We were modern Orthodox Jews. My grandfather was my Moses, and my mother wasn't allowed. My mother came when she was 5, so she had no accent. She went to school, but in the 8th grade, her parents took her out because they needed her to work. They were taking in refugees coming in, especially, relatives or lunch-like neighbors.
What was your mother's name?
Gussie,
Gussie.
in Yiddish, Genendel.
Okay. And your father's name?
David.
David. So at what point does Ruth Gruber begin to sense a connection to Jewish peoplehood and, in fact, the emerging state of Israel?
In 46, when the war ended. Of course, during the war, we knew a little bit more in Washington than the rest of the country. And I was then working as special assistant to the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, who, of all the cabinet members, including Morgenthau, who did a lot, but Ickes worked the hardest to save Jews. And so I knew a little about the Holocaust, and I began to fight. And I felt so helpless. There was so little I could do, but I hoped something could turn up so I could help save some of those Jews who were being murdered every single day.
Do you think you can look back and understand why this touched your soul, because you were really you had got your PhD when you were 20 years old. You went to work for the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. You were a journalist. You had been sent to Alaska by Ickes to do some work on the surface, and basically you were almost doing some intelligence work for the United States of America. So all of your professional work to that point was in the general arena. You write in one of your books about how you experienced the day of Pearl Harbor, and you were in Alaska at the time. So at that moment, Ruth Gruber's self-identity had more to do with a woman of the world. You were way ahead of your time. I mean, we could talk if we had enough time about your views of feminism, but that's not what I'm here for at the moment. But you were way, way ahead of your time. And here you were, a journalist, a writer, part of the most exciting government that the United States had for years and years and years. But you're being honest enough to say to us, it wasn't at that point that you had a Jewish identity. And then something happens to you, Ruth. And I want to know if you can, reach back and find for us, articulate for us what it was that began. How did that emerge in you? And do you remember how you felt and what was in your soul?
In 1944, Roosevelt got a report written by a lawyer in the Treasury Department, one of Morgenthau's lawyers, which he called Acquiescence of the United States Government in the Murder of Jews. And the man who wrote it was a friend of mine, and I knew a lot of the people in Treasury. And I was constantly in touch with them, learning what they learned about what Jews were suffering in the middle of the Holocaust. The war was almost won, but the Nazis continued the war against the Jews. And I became personally aware of it from my friendship with others in the government. And then when I read that Roosevelt, after reading this report, decided that he had to do something and that he would bring in 1,000 refugees. And then he did what he did so often. He dropped the whole thing in Ickes' lap. So I hurried to my office because I read it in the Washington Post. And I asked Ickes' appointment secretary to make a date for me. I said, it's urgent. So she made a date for me that morning. And I said, Mr. Secretary, here is this group that we're going to bring in. I'm going to bring them to a place in Upper New York. And I said, somebody has to go over and help them. And Ickes had been looking very tired. So he took off his gold-rimmed glasses, polished them, and said, you're right, somebody has to go over. I'm going to send you. Which, of course, was what I hoped he would say.
You had hoped he was going to send you?
Of course.
Mm-hmm. Well, that experience, the experience of being with those 1,000 refugees who were in Naples, Italy, and you became their mother, even though you were younger than most of them, many of them, I should say.
They called me Mother Ruth.
Mother Ruth. And you shepherded them. And by the way, people should read your book, Haven, which also was made into a movie, in which you virtually put your arms around these 1,000 refugees, about 850 of which were Jewish.
982.
But they weren't all Jewish.
No.
No. But the vast majority were.
Oh, yes. So
you taught them English. You explained to them what America was, and then you traveled with them to Oswego, where they were put in another camp. Not a prison camp, but they were in a camp inside barbed wire for 2 years. And you were the one who fought for their becoming American citizens. And it seems that if that experience did have some profound impact on you and who you saw yourself as, And it seems to me, Ruth, from that moment on, so much, not all, but so much of your efforts were on behalf of the Jewish people in one way or another.
Well, you asked a question before, at what point it was on that ship, and I had taken their life history and typed it all up so Ickes could bring it to Roosevelt. And the wind was blowing through my hair, and the ship was blacked out because Nazi planes were flying around. And I knew from that moment on, my life would be bound up with rescue and survival. And that was the moment on that ship with those refugees. And I always feel that if you look into your soul, you find you have tools. I looked into my soul and I found I had two tools, words and images. I could write and I could take photographs. And I used those two tools from that moment on for rescue and survival, and to fight injustice wherever I saw it.
Ruth, did you ever meet FDR? You know, the way history has portrayed it, he is not treated kindly within the Jewish community. He made many decisions to prevent Jewish refugees from arriving on American shores when they could have been saved from Nazi Germany.
What we don't remember is that at that period, even though we were fighting Nazis, we were an overtly anti-Semitic country. They were calling Roosevelt Rosenfeld. They said he's not a Yankee with blue blood, he's a Jew. They were calling the New Deal the Jew deal, and that we were fighting the war for the Jews. Every Sunday afternoon, we all sat paralyzed, listening to the radio. There was no TV then. Father Coughlin in Detroit was filling the air with the worst anti-Semitic trash, and people believed him. And he was converting people to Catholicism, to his kind of anti-Semitism. Roosevelt was a great politician, and he knew that if you were a humanitarian first and then a politician, you could never become president of the United States. You have to be a politician first, and then you can be a humanitarian. So in order for him to carry through all the things he did that still marks the quality of our life, Social Security, the WPA, all these alphabetical things that pulled us up out of the Depression and got us out of poverty. Roosevelt wanted to change America and did. Our new president is following so much of what Roosevelt did in those first 100 days. So I think that Roosevelt could have done more, but all of us could have done more. Everybody in the country, if he gave us a chance. I was so thrilled that I was given a chance to do something. But all of us, again, had to look in our soul and find things we could do. And I think we have to stop demonizing Roosevelt and thank him for the good he did and say he could have done more, no question, but so could all of we. We were an anti-Semitic country.
I'm wondering whether you feel that there is a lack of appreciation among the American people in general and among the Jewish community in particular for the history that brings the state of Israel to where it is today. Would you speak to me about your sense of our understanding of history, since you're the one who lived it so vividly?
I was so fortunate that I could travel with the first in 46, right after the end of the war, with the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry on Palestine. as it was then called. And when we went to all these DP camps, displaced persons camps, and listened to their stories, they were nightmares. You didn't sleep at night. You replayed in your head everything they told you. I don't know how people survived, but they did. And the one thing that kept them going was Eretz Yisrael. They kept telling themselves in the death camps, I must live, because if I live, I'll get there. And wherever we went, the committee would ask all kinds of questions, but they always asked one question. Why do you want to go to Palestine? It's such a poor country. It doesn't have enough water. It doesn't have enough food. The Arabs and Jews are fighting. Why do you want to go? Well, we got a lot of irrelevant answers. But the most poignant answer was from a 16-year-old orphan boy. And he said, everybody has a home. The British have a home, the French, the Russians, the Americans. Only we Jews, we don't have a home. Don't ask us the question, ask the world. And it was true. It was a world problem. It was a problem that Truman once said to me, President Truman. He said there would be no problems in the Middle East if not for that dirty three-letter word, oil, O-I-L. And to this day, that problem still exists.
You were in your 30s when you visited these DP camps. A lot of them
just started.
Yes, a lot of the men who you were with did not have your orientation to the Jewish people. Do you remember what the general feeling was as you went to these DP camps with these other, many of whom were British, but these other, officials who were trying to determine whether the Jews in these DP camps should be allowed to go to Palestine? What was their sense?
Well, when we began the committee in '46, there were 6 Brits selected by Ernest Bevin, who was then foreign minister in London, and who didn't want to let one single Jew into Palestine if he could help it. He was pretty good in London on problems of labor and so on, but on the problem of Jews, it was pure, horrible anti-Semitism. I often think we should set up a monument to him because he was a good Orthodox anti-Semite. And if he had opened his mind or his heart or his gates to Palestine, we might not have had a state at the time we got it. But because he was so angry, so vicious, and when President Truman asked him, why do you want them kept out? They've lived through so many horrors. Why don't you let in 100,000? He couldn't turn the president down. Their economy was in tatters. So he suggested what governments often suggest, that they create a committee. Sometimes they do good, sometimes it's an excuse for doing nothing. So he selected the 6 Brits. He didn't realize that among them there were men who didn't agree with him, as well as men who felt even more strongly than he did. So that was the British side. On the American side, President Truman thought they would all feel as he did, that there should be a home for Jews. But there were a few Americans who didn't feel it either. But after we visited these DP camps, after we listened to all these terrible stories and met the survivors, it began to do something. Their hearts were opened, their souls began to open. And after 4 big, solid months of traveling all through Germany, all through what was then Palestine, and the whole Arab world as far as we could get in. They met in Switzerland, fought each other. Some flew home quickly to get advice from their presidents or king, queen. So it was very important that when they took a vote, the vote was unanimous that Palestine should be opened to 100,000 displaced persons, DPs. Well, the joy in Palestine was not to be believed. People were dancing, singing in the streets. In New York, they were dancing in the streets for 3 days. Didn't last very long, because Ernest Bevin said, in effect, over my dead body. So all that work, 4 months, hard travel, hard work, nightmares, was in vain.
How did you feel personally when that happened?
So depressed and so angry, and I wanted to throttle Bevin. Well, the world began to see terror. Terror begets terror. And finally, Bevin said to the UN, "You take over. I'm through." A lot of people thought the UN would get down on its knees and say, "Please, Mr. Bevin, you're the only one who knows how to handle these ordinary Jews." But that didn't happen. The UN then said, "You don't want to handle it, we'll handle it." And they created their own.
Investigative committee.
It was called UNSCOP.
And I have understood that one of the things that changed some of the people's mind on that committee was watching the way the British dealt with the Exodus, the ship in 1947, which they almost sank in the Mediterranean Sea, and then refused to allow those on board, these Jews who were coming to Palestine, having survived the Holocaust. They forbid them. They didn't take them to Cyprus. They sent them back first to France and then to Germany. And of course, the Exodus is one of the things that you're associated with. You wrote this extraordinary book about the 1947 Exodus. You were there also. You saw this happen, Ruth. I know the history, but I don't know what it would have been like, what it was like to be a caring Jew watching this happen. What I really want to know from you is, how did it make you feel when you saw what was happening on the Exodus?
Amazement that the people had survived. They came on a ship renamed Exodus. It had been built as a sort of excursion boat to hold about 400 people. It held 4,500. They didn't care where they slept. They were going to Eretz Yisrael. And the British guarded the port at Haifa so that it looked more like a war zone than Italy had looked like in the middle of World War II when I covered it. And the British told the reporters when they pulled us all together, "We don't allow you to talk to any of those refugees. If we catch any of you talking, we'll kick you off and we won't let you back here." But he was a little martinet, and he never walked. He danced, and every time I had a question for him, I had to dance after him. And when the people were pulled off, some came off, their heads all bandaged, their arms bandaged, their legs bandaged. They had been brutally treated by the British. First outside territorial waters, British warships
Rammed the ship.
from both sides and destroyed it. One whole deck was absolutely destroyed. And the people on it were determined to fight. But the British came aboard the ship, still outside waters, with firecrackers to scare the people, with guns, with truncheons, hitting them on the head. The first mate, Bill Bernstein from California, he had been in our Navy, our Marines. He was the most beloved member of the crew, curly red hair. He wanted to prevent the British from coming into the wheelhouse so then they could take over the ship. So he stood guarding it, and a British Marine took his truncheon, hit him on the skull, broke his brain, fell unconscious. They picked him up, the refugee doctors did, and put him on the bed of the real Captain Ike. But he never opened his eyes again. They put him on a stretcher with one knee up. When he came off the Exodus, he looked like a sleeping teenager. And it just broke your heart.
And he died.
He died after he got off the ship.
Also, the people on the Exodus had no weapons of their own.
They got word, you may not use any bullets, you may not use guns. The Jewish Agency, which was the de facto government of the Jews in Palestine, sent word by cable, no guns. You can use fruits, you can use canned beef, you can use maybe something from the ship, but no bullets, no weapons. Well, a 16-year-old orphan was watching the whole thing from a porthole, his face sticking out. And he saw a Marine come up, and he had an orange. So he threw the orange at the Marine. The Marine got his gun out, shot this orphan in the face and killed him. And another orphan was shot in the belly. So 3 were killed still on the ship. And so many were wounded in their face. Even strong refugees were wounded in their face and their legs.
And I want to make sure everybody understands. This is a boat bringing survivors of the Holocaust to Haifa in the hopes that they would become repatriated, in essence, into what was about to become the State of Israel, was still Palestine. And they were looking for, to use a word you have used, a Jewish haven. And the British refused to let these Jewish refugees in because they were at that moment buckling under Arab pressure. You have said already that you would have loved to have strangled Bevan. In general, Ruth, during this period of time, how did you and your friends feel about the British in general?
Well, we didn't feel bad about British people. In fact, in Palestine, to be a British gentleman was what every Jew seemed to want to be. They were teaching them English, and the Jews were going to plays, Shakespeare. They loved British culture. So our fight was with British policy, with the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office, not with the people of England. And we were furious because they were bringing the paratroops and the soldiers who maltreated the Irish in Ireland to Palestine as police to take care of Jews. And I wrote a whole series of articles called Palestine as the Ireland of 1921. It was British policy, and that policy they thought back through their grandparents. And Truman felt the same way, because he sent a young professor from Philadelphia, head of law, to find out what was happening in Palestine. And he reported back to Truman that the soldiers even were treating these Jews so badly, just like the Nazis did. The only difference between the British, who were trained, you know, to treat them the way they treated the Irish, he said the only difference is that the British don't kill them.
On May 14th, 1948, where were you?
I had come back to America from covering all the DP camps, and I was sitting in the UN with other reporters, and we were waiting because I had gotten word that the people in the State Department were going to pull the rug from Truman and suggest that Palestine become a trusteeship for the United Nations, which would have completely destroyed the idea of Palestine as a Jewish state.
Instead of partition, they wanted a trusteeship.
Right. After partition was what the UNSCOP, the United Nations Committee, voted for, and the UN in November voted it at the UN.
November 29th, 1947, the United Nations accepted the notion, the concept of partition.
Of two states.
Two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state.
Right.
And then lo and behold, on May 14th, when you're in Flushing Meadows, Queens, at the United Nations General Assembly, you know that there's a last-ditch effort by American State Department to pull the rug out of Truman, out from under Truman, and to initiate trusteeship instead of partition. And then what do you see happen?
And one of the ambassadors carrying a speech for trusteeship is walking up the steps to the podium when a reporter stops him and says, "Look at this." And he reads a telegram from AP, Associated Press. David Ben-Gurion has just declared the birth of a Jewish state in a museum in Tel Aviv. And this guy turns white, and I'm watching him, and a reporter next to me says, "Look, he's going down, probably going to the bathroom." I said, "He's going home. They're not going to get away with this trusteeship nonsense." And he left the UN and never came back.
11 minutes later, Harry Truman recognizes the State of Israel on behalf of the United States.
Right.
Can you tell us how you, Ruth Gruber, felt? You had done a lot to make that day happen. Can you remember how you felt?
I was weeping with joy. I stood up, I wanted to dance. It was unbelievable, but he did it.
So Ruth, today there's an effort still to suggest that Israel was a mistake, the creation of Israel was a mistake, that there should not be a two-state solution, that there should not be two states, one of them should be a Jewish state, but there should only be one state now. And there are still people who question Israel's right to exist. What would you say to them?
I would quote David Ben-Gurion. I learned that he was close to death, so I hurried to Israel and asked the soldiers who were taking care of him if I could see him, because he was living in his very modest apartment in Tel Aviv, surrounded only by soldiers. They were his boys. His wife, who watched him carefully and took care of him, was dead and buried in stable care in the Negev. And I sat next to him. He was lying on an army type of bed with big white covers. And I said, "Master, will there ever be peace between Arabs and Jews?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Where will it come from?" He said, Egypt. I said, Egypt? They start every war. The Fedayeen, the terrorists, come from Egypt. They have hand grenades. They throw them in your children's homes. Oh, he said, forget it. That was, he always used that. Whenever he didn't agree with me, he said, forget it. So I said, I'll forget it. So Egypt, all right. When will it happen? Not in my time, not in your time, but in your children's time. And I kept repeating, Master, will there be peace? And I ended the interview by his saying, there will be peace. And I wrote it across my heart. And that's what I carry. And that's what I say to these people who say there shouldn't be two states. He said there should be. He said the Arabs know a whole generation is rising up, and they know that we can cure diseases that they still have, that we cured 20 years ago, like bilharzia. It's something you get in your feet going in rivers barefoot. And they have oil, which we discovered, but they have it now. And they have chemicals that we need. And they will grow up learning that war doesn't solve these problems. Peace does. We will have peace, and there will be peace between Arabs and Jews. And that's the message that I believe. It may take longer. I have grandchildren, and I'm praying that it will happen in my 4 grandchildren's time.
That's very, very beautiful. Ruth Gruber, this has been so wonderful of you to sit with me. I really hope I can put a semicolon, not a period here. I want more of you. And I want to tell you something else. When one looks back at the sweep of Jewish history over the past 100 years, there have been a number of women who have made a unique contribution to Jewish life. Golda Meir, Henrietta Zold, Hannah Senesh, in a brief moment of exquisite self-sacrifice and vision. And in very many ways, Ruth Gruber has also been one of the women who has helped shape who we are today, American Jewish life. It would be presumptuous of me, and yet I still say to you on behalf of all of us who have been the recipients of what you have done, the courage you've had, the mind and the heart that you've brought to your work and to your commitment to the Jewish people in the state of Israel. You have done an extraordinary service to the general American and world community, and most specifically to your people, the Jewish people. Thank you for all you've done, all you continue to do. May you live many, many more years, and may we have a chance to speak together. I thank you, Ruth, for this time. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome, and it's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, darling.
And your questions were very good and very acute and on the mark.
Thank you. I'm flattered.
A remarkable human being and a devoted Jew, Ruth Gruber. I hope you enjoyed the chance to meet her. For me, it was an absolutely wonderful experience. I fell in love with her. As always, I invite your comments. Please email me or write me this week. And if you wish to be in touch with Ruth yourself, you can do so through me. And so until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $18 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media, to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.